A desert planet with twin suns.
Why do I sense we've picked up another pathetic life form?
Use my knowledge. Much to learn. You still have.
Welcome back to Twin Sun Talks, folks. I'm your host, Jonah Liu. Thank you so much for listening. And welcome to episode 66. And so if you couldn't guess, we're actually going to be talking about Order 66 in this episode. Because, I'm cool like that. Anyways, let's dive into ARC Trooper training.
Gentlemen, who wants to be an ARC Trooper? I do, sir!
So for those of you who don't know, Order 66 is one of 150 executive orders able to be called upon by the Supreme Chancellor or essentially the Republic Security Council. And what it did was it marked all Jedi as traitors to the Galactic Republic to be executed with extreme prejudice. Now, this was first depicted in Revenge of the Sith and expanded upon in various lore such as the Clone Wars, the Bad Batch, and Jedi Fallen Order, the video game. And it essentially marked the end for the Jedi Order as it existed since its conception and the beginning of the galaxy-wide darkness that was the Galactic Empire. And honestly, Order 66 is one of the saddest things in Star Wars, if not the saddest thing in Star Wars. And honestly, I feel pretty sadistic when I say this, but I love Order 66 content. I think that it's some of the best Star Wars stuff that we get, and I'm really glad that we've been getting some more of it recently, and I hope we get even more of it, honestly. Just because I think that it really encapsulates the brutality of Sidious's rise to power and Anakin's turn to the dark side and just how far they were willing to go to achieve that. And also just the emotionality of seeing these clones, especially with the development they got in the Clone Wars, turning on their Jedi generals. It's just really, really heartbreaking. And I don't know, maybe I'm just an emo boy, but I'm a sucker for some good heartbreaking content. But under this order, thousands of Jedi were killed at once at the command of Chancellor Palpatine, a.k.a. Darth Sidious, as well as at the hand of the fallen Jedi Knight, Anakin Skywalker, a.k.a. Darth Vader. And now, if you want to learn a little bit more about the history of the Clone Army, you can go back and listen to my 24th episode. I go through a basic history of the Grand Army of the Republic and just the clones in general. And so if you want a more in-depth look at that, go back and listen to that episode. But in summary, when the clones were commissioned by Count Dooku, he made sure to include inhibitor chips programmed with specific commands that would be followed explicitly without thought. And one of those orders was Order 66. And the genius of Order 66 was that the Sith undermined the Jedi by making their downfall their companions on the battlefield. And the Jedi formed very close bonds with the clones and often were very good friends with them, which once again is why the Order ends up being so heartbreaking when you see it in the context of the Clone Wars and stuff like that. And one criticism of Order 66 that I see a lot is that the Jedi would have sensed the betrayal of the clones. And I gotta say that that's not entirely correct. And in some cases, you can kind of see that that is the case. Like with Ahsoka, she senses something else aside from the betrayal of the clones. And Yoda does the same thing, essentially. He senses the betrayal of the clones against other of his companions and then is able to sense whenever Commander Gree is coming up to him. But the reason that Jedi weren't able to sense the betrayal was because the clones did it without emotion. They gave no internal indication of betrayal. There was no sense. There was nothing to sense, basically. The clones followed the order without a hint of malice or remorse. They weren't angry. They weren't sad about it. They just did it. And they were essentially turned into little more than flesh droids by the command, and they lost any individuality that they had had up until that point. And that's another really sad thing, is that you get to see all the clones as individuals in the Clone Wars, and then you see that stripped from them by this executive order. In shows like The Bad Batch, you see them turned into a military force. And I'll get into that a little bit more later, but Sidious's plan worked very subtly and over a very long period of time, and it's very interesting because, first off, you have a very convenient defense system for the Republic that's been secretly created and kind of comes in at a very opportune time whenever he's also orchestrated the secession of various worlds, causing a civil war which the Jedi are forced to take charge of. And then the Jedi are slowly turned into villains who are perpetuating the conflict in order to claim power in the eyes of the populace, and they put the Jedi in a position where they are in direct contradiction to their doctrine as generals in a war, because as Mace Windu says in Attack of the Clones, they're keepers of the peace, they're not soldiers. They're not supposed to be leading a conflict. They're supposed to be trying, and obviously they are trying to end it, but at the same time, they're not doing so in a way that is very Jedi-like, and you can see a lot of the Jedi beginning to stray from the Jedi path during the war. Ultimately, this all culminates with the Sith using the Jedi's own soldiers to shoot them down when they think the war is finally at a close. Whenever General Grievous has been defeated, whenever Count Dooku has been killed, they think it's about over, and then they're just shot in the back. And it's so heartbreaking and so well executed, pun not intended, that, I mean, I think that a show surrounding Order 66 would be really, really interesting, just to see the Jedi after the fact, any of the Jedi that did survive. And I will be going into some Jedi that did survive after this, but that being said, there's going to be some spoilers for the Clone Wars and the Bad Batch and several comic runs that I actually haven't read. I just know information about them, and a little bit for Jedi Fallen Order. So just a spoiler warning for that. If you don't want any spoilers for those, then go ahead and skip this bit. There's going to be some pretty significant spoilers for the rest of this episode, actually, but if you're okay with that, I think that a lot of them are pretty obvious, but if you haven't watched any Star Wars shows before, then they might kind of ruin the experience for you, kind of ruin some of the gravitas of the moment. So go ahead and skip this if you don't want to have any of that spoiled, and if you don't mind, then let's dive into it. We see defects in the Order in the likes of Tup being the young clone with the top knot, and the teardrop on his helmet. His chip decayed and caused him to commit Order 66 prematurely. And this led to ARC Trooper 5's nearly uncovering Sidious's plot before he is killed. Other times that the Order didn't work, just straight up, was with members of the Bad Batch, most of them at least, or soldiers like Captain Hauser or Clone Commando Gregor. With the Bad Batch, we see Crosshair exhibit a strong affinity for following the Order, but he's not completely turned into like a mindless flesh droid like most of the regular clones. But they're able to enhance his chip, the Empire is, and then kind of put them completely under their control. And then we also get to see Wrecker's chip activate after continual head trauma, which is rather interesting. And obviously, we see both of their chips get taken out. Crosshair stays on the side of the Empire, and Wrecker goes back to his brothers in the squad. But I still think that Crosshair might not have his chip out. I don't know. There's something's kind of fishy going on there. In the last arc of the Clone Wars, we get to see how Rex was able to briefly resist the Order to warn Ahsoka about it before turning completely. And then we also learn that the clones are fully aware of their actions as stated by Rex after his chip is removed, which makes the Order all the more devastating. Like, he's like, oh, I could have killed you. And he's completely aware of that, even though he's just following his programming, basically. In the Bad Batch, we get to see how the clones operate after Order 66, and like I said, they're much more like a military police force than before. And it's very interesting with Dave Filoni, and what he said is that essentially they were looking for more of a stormtrooper vibe. They didn't want all the colorful markings on the clones that we saw in the Clone Wars. They wanted all of the clones that we saw to be just the straight kind of generic white armor, which I thought was an interesting play, except for aside from shock troopers. And then we also get to see clones like Hauser, which it's a very even if you don't necessarily realize it, it's a very distinct thing to see some of the clones with their original decals, like with Hauser and his awesome, like, kind of teal aqua armor. Really, really cool. And in the case of Hauser, it's unclear why he retained his kind of individuality and free will after the Order. My theory is that it's because he wasn't working directly with the Jedi. He was working just with Cham Syndulla. So Order 66 didn't apply to him. Same with Gregor. Gregor was a clone commando who was found by Colonel Meeble Gascon in D Squad on Abafar after being marooned there in a shuttle crash, which left him with amnesia. I think that probably the head trauma that caused his amnesia well, first of all, we kind of see that he has a bit of a screw loose in both Rebels and in the Bad Batch, but I would say that probably the head trauma is what caused his chip to malfunction and not work, because we see him taken into custody and then rescued by the Bad Batch. And then Hauser, I think that the most interesting thing from the Bad Batch was Hauser successfully convincing many of his fellow clone brothers to disregard the Order, which would imply that the Order is slowly wearing off as time goes on, which is a super, super interesting notion. And in Legends, there was a clone uprising, and I think that that's probably something that we'll see in Bad Batch Season 2. And another interesting thing is whenever Kamino's getting bombarded, and I think this is probably the last episode, we see a clone is the one that delivers the news to Admiral Rampart, and he's very sad about it. He's like, the city has been completely destroyed. It's like there's like a little bit of hesitancy, a little bit of sadness, which I think is showing some of the clones' awareness and individuality returning to them. And I'm sure I'm missing quite a few things. So if there's anything noteworthy that you notice that I haven't touched on about Order 66, please feel free to let me know. I know that I haven't talked too much about Fallen Order because I really don't know much about it. But I'm about to talk about survivors of Order 66, and I'm definitely going to talk a little bit about it then. But yeah, let me know. Email me at twinsuntalks@gmail.com if I've missed anything of significance, and I'll definitely make sure to address that later. But as far as Jedi who survived Order 66, there are quite a few in canon, but I'm just going to touch on some of the more prominent ones and the ones that have a bit of a name outside of the comic issues that they've been introduced in and stuff like that. There are some obscure ones that I'm not mentioning, but I'm trying to choose ones that kind of have a bit of significance to people who have maybe watched the shows and stuff like that. So obviously we have the likes of Obi-Wan and Yoda. We see them survive in the movies. And they're kind of the ones that we definitely know for sure that survived. And then Ahsoka Tano and Darth Maul both survived the same kind of attack on board the Jedi cruiser, and then Ahsoka had to let Maul escape in order to save Rex. And we both see them down the line as well. Cal Kestis, who is the main protagonist of Jedi Fallen Order, survives Order 66 because his master sacrifices himself for the sake of Cal's escape. And then essentially the gameplay is Cal's adventures after several years after the events of Order 66. We also have another Padawan who was saved by his master. The name is Caleb Doom, later known as Kanan Jarrus, who is one of the main protagonists of the Star Wars Rebels show. Jakka Sanu, who is the librarian in Star Wars in the Jedi Temple, also survived for a brief time. She was eventually killed by Darth Vader, but she did survive the initial order against the Jedi, and she was trying to, I think, help some younglings escape. Either that or protecting the Holocron Vault. Don't entirely remember the details, but point being, she did survive and was killed by Vader. Either Vader or the Inquisitors. Don't entirely remember the details because I heard that secondhand from another YouTuber. But next up, we have Eth Koth, who was one of the Zabrak Jedi Masters that we got to know in the Clone Wars. super cool character. He actually left the Jedi Order to start a family and then was found by Vader after Order 66 and was subsequently killed, unfortunately. But that's a pretty interesting thing that not a lot of people know about. Obviously, Grogu, Baby Yoda, who we get to meet in the Mandalorian show, did survive Order 66 and was taken into custody by the Empire. And then Quinlan Voss, this one is not, I don't think it's canon necessarily, but he allegedly survived, and he's the one with the dreadlocks. Awesome character. I'm really hoping that we get to see him in the Bad Batch. I think that they would jive really well together. And I just want some more Quinlan Voss content. I think that he's a really, really cool character. That's about all that I have for this episode, but it wouldn't be a proper episode if I didn't leave you with just a little bit more. So while this is not canon, there are a couple legends, explanations for some of the other orders other than Order 66. And one of them was far more sadistic than Order 66, and that was Order 37, which allowed for clones to essentially hold an entire civilian population hostage, just arrest everyone on a large scale, and threaten mass execution of the captives in order to capture a single individual. And what this did was it essentially preyed on the compassion of the Jedi, knowing that they wouldn't allow mass execution at their expense, basically, that the Jedi would sacrifice themselves if their sacrifice meant that a large amount of people were going to live, or anybody was going to live. So it was really sad and really terrible, but yeah, that is Order 37. Not officially canon, but still pretty interesting. That's about all that I have for today's episode. Make sure you follow us on Instagram at Twin Sun Talks. We're going to be on day 24 of our 31-day Star Wars challenge. Almost done there. And we're talking about what our favorite score in Star Wars is. So what our favorite music is. Go ahead and check that out. Make sure to follow us on any streaming platforms. Just look up Twin Sun Talks wherever you listen to your podcasts. And subscribe to us on YouTube at Twin Sun Talks Podcast. Yeah. But that's about all that I have. No, it's not. Make sure that you stay tuned this Wednesday for our Book of Boba Fett review if you've been keeping up with that. And if you haven't, then you should keep up with it. That's all that I have. You've taken your first steps into a larger world. May the Force be with you, and I will see y'all in the next episode. Bye, friends.